and welcome to another episode of Fintech Focus TV with me, Toby. Today, it's a really interesting subject and one which we haven't covered in as much detail as I think we probably should have done over the last year, which is cybersecurity. I think it's an area there which has been on the tip of everyone's tongue. It's been one of the busiest markets that we've seen over the course of last year, and who better to bring insight and interest in the subject than David Prince over at Baringa Partners. David, it is lovely to have you on the show. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So listen, you've been in a busy area over the last year or so, and I think cyber's really thrown itself to the forefront. Before we get into a few of the areas that I really want to sort of, I guess, probe your immense knowledge on, give us a bit of background about yourself and Baringa's position in the space.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background, I'm David. I've been running Baringa's cybersecurity consulting business for about four years or so now, but Baringa as a firm, we center ourselves around advising organizations on how they can better identify, measure and manage their cybersecurity risk. And generally the outcome we tend to work towards is helping our clients become more resilient, right? I mean, that's where the industries are going. That's really, I think, what boards are kind of understanding now is you can't prevent everything. You need to understand what can and cannot be tolerated versus preventing data breaches that come in kind of in all kind of manifestations. So that's kind of how we center ourselves around advising and delivering strong advisory and capability change within our clients. Personally, my background is in advisory and consulting. Before joining Baringa, I led a crisis management capability around cybersecurity crises specifically, working with a cross-functional team of risk advisors, intelligence analysts and legal professionals. That was a really interesting role, helping organizations both kind of prepare and preempt for a crisis, but then also kind of work with them through a crisis. And before that, I worked in industry as a chief security officer. So I've got kind of, I guess, on balance, a good combination of external points of view and advisory, and also kind of what it's like to be, I suppose, within a large organization trying to effect positive change for cybersecurity.
And you've seen a sort of broad spectrum, I guess, from that as well, because Baringa is a company I've got tremendous respect for, and we've had various of the team on it in various different parts beforehand, born out of the energy space, but also very strong in numerous other areas. Your client base spreads across everything from fintech to energy to all sorts of areas. Tell us a little bit about the spectrum of clients you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess the heart of Baringa is our kind of industry-led approach to how we work with our clients and how we engage with the market. So absolutely, you're right. We're born out of the energy space. We've got significant expertise both at an industry level and a cybersecurity perspective on energy, but actually it spans much more than that. So we operate across the spectrum of financial services, banks, asset management funds, insurance, across all of that, but also consumer products and retail, public sector, life sciences, telco, media and technology. And there's a real advantage there in terms of our exposure to those industries and how we can advise across industry. We often find that our clients are very interested to understand, actually, we have an agenda around operational resilience in our financial services institutes. What's happening in energy? What's happening in the telecommunications space? What can we glean from the positives, the failures, even just what other organizations are doing in different spaces? So not just around different sizes and scales of businesses, just completely different. That's becoming more and more valuable as we see different regulatory regimes across different industries. You look at operational resilience in financial services. You may look at how does that relate to something like the NIS regulation, the Network and Information Systems regulation, that's centered on resilience. In energy, how do the two come together and what can we learn? So yeah, there's a lot of value in that, and it also gives us a really good perspective to kind of a macro level around what's happening and what the general kind of trajectory is for organizations over the next kind of 3 to 5 to 7 years.
I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because we've been talking for a long time now about how financial services can learn from different areas across all areas of tech. So I think there's other areas, particularly e-commerce, where and their use of data in particular, which has been very much an area which financial services can learn from other industries. And I love the fact that you're able to give that sort of spectrum of advice from I guess industry to industry on a sector specific vertical or tech specific vertical about what's happening in the marketplace. And this is, as I said before, one of the areas which we've seen the biggest heat map on as more and more remote work's come through, and we've seen business continuity plans coming at various different levels of structure and strength, and technology being put under strain. That's created opportunities for breaches and for cyber threats, etc., etc. So I imagine there's been a sort of considerable increase. If we look at the media, we're seeing endless breaches, seemingly endless breaches, being reported, and there's loads and loads of things we can learn from that. So if we point towards that sort of endless breach story that we're looking at the moment, what are some of the key insights that you've seen in there that we can take away?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question, and I think it's safe to say that over the past 12 months, organizations, across industry have really been tested on their kind of security performance, on their ability to be agile and essentially, adapt to, I guess, the world we're living in today. You're totally right. What we're seeing in the media, and we've got to be careful when we look at the media, right, around our own bias and around the sources of information we're reading and how reliable it is. But I think there are a number of insights that we can glean. I think the first is, and I think it's fairly kind of safe to say this, in terms of the threat landscape and threat actors, I think we've reached a level of kind of unprecedented around the confidence and the evasiveness and just overall boldness that we're seeing from threat actors. We're seeing far more now, I believe.
Boldness is the word, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. The vulnerabilities are there at an organizational level. Right? I mean, we're fragile right now. Many organizations are trying to, survive. And that in essence creates opportunity and vulnerability in business. We were talking just a few minutes ago about what this means around how ruthless organizations need to be in terms of prioritizing the key initiatives that they have to ensure that they're able to, I guess, continue to operate. I think it's kind of going back to the kind of the threat landscape point and threat actors being more confident and bold. What this has done, I guess, in turn is just, I guess, put more emphasis and importance and value in organizations needing reliable threat intelligence as a capability. And threat intelligence has existed for several years now, but it's becoming more and more mature and more valuable. And I think the last 12 months, and as we've seen from the media, threat intelligence is, as a capability, far more important, I think, than it's ever been. So, I guess the question that business leaders and chief security officers and those in IT should be asking is, are we doing enough around evaluating the threats we're facing into? Do we understand the threat landscape, and are we incorporating that within our wider risk management processes? That's really
and you're certainly seeing people do that well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some really good regimes out there, particularly in the financial services space, and more so in energy with things like the NIS regulation, but frameworks like CBIST, for example, and advisories from Bank of England, for example, are really helping organizations take more of a threat-based approach to their work. And it does bring a really important insight. And, ultimately, when I think about this, I think about, how are organizations managing their risks? Do they really understand the risks that they need to be managing? And when you incorporate threats, it really just helps to kind of bring it to life, and it helps with, I guess, more decisive action from a risk management perspective. So that's quite important.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think people are sort of sat with that sort of paralysis at various different stages, and I think if we look at companies, particularly in the financial services sector, probably the regulatory landscape of the last decade and the pressure that's been put on that has thrust this very much to the forefront. So we're probably looking, as I said, if we look at data as an area, where we see increased threats on, I guess the financial services, should I say, being outgunned by other areas. What we're actually seeing in cyber is probably an area where FS and energy, and energy trading, which is another big area that we focus in on, seeing probably a leading point on their security awareness and the ability to get in front of it. And I guess that's really important for them to have done that anyway as well, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that where we have to be careful about what we read in the media is naturally, there's a clear objective in the media to seek a strong and large readership, right? And so certain events will be embellished somewhat, and I think it's important to really think about when these cyber events are happening, whether it's an insider threat, a data leak of some kind, or something more nefarious, actually what do we think is the source of it? And actually what we're seeing is, like several years before, a lot of it kind of stems in how organizations are focusing on their kind of foundational security controls. So I'm talking about things like identity, talking about things like securing supply chain and how that's approached as an area of risk for cybersecurity, and also things like patching, vulnerability management. These are all kind of foundational capabilities and controls. They're by no means easy. People refer to them as basic things. You may see them as basic, but also very, very hard to implement well. And I think it's important when we look at these events we're seeing in the media, is there is a commonality around, is the source of these things a lack of robust patching or coverage in patching? Is it around actually just not being as, I guess, robust and clear on who needs access to what data and to what services in the business? Are we being, I guess, too liberal with access control? Really fundamental points. When I consider these, they're not the sexiest topics in cybersecurity. It's very easy to get attracted to, the cutting edge AI-driven automated security tool. But actually, when you look at these foundational controls, which are less sexy, like good password management, for example, good patch control, these attributes to, what I would say is 80% of risk mitigation. It's that kind of effort that needs to be applied. We see the media and general focus across boards as well, in my experience, shifting towards the kind of the 0 days and the really sophisticated attacks, which actually detract from what's really important, which is, are we doing the right things at a foundational level? To me, that's really important. Are we focusing on the 80% of risk mitigation through those foundational priorities?
It's about 4 or 5 years ago, we held a panel and we had about 150, 200 people from the FS industry there, and we had on that the CTO of a fairly substantial hedge fund who was there speaking on it, and he was brilliant in his simplicity, and it was the human aspect of security that he was really talking, and the whole piece was built around security and the importance of in financial services. And actually it was those human elements that he really focused in on that I thought were made it a really interesting conversation, because we were expecting something on intelligent deep technology and how you need to be sophisticated to deal with this, but realistically it was, as you said, people just not being idiots when they're sent something there saying, can you buy me 1,500 quid's worth of Amazon vouchers or whatever it may be, and responding to that. And it's that these things which are underestimated in terms of communication that allows for that resilience to come through. I think that's one of the key things that you're probably seeing and preaching, I would guess.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think there's a lot to be said for taking a simple approach. There's a very kind of natural path that we can often go down, which is very technical in nature. And ultimately, when we think about, what does good look like for a cybersecurity, information security function in a business, it's things like, do we have the right governance? Are we spotting the root causes of issues that are that we're kind of going through time and time again? And are we making the right risk management? That requires some simplicity in your view, and not as too much of a focus on individual assets and technology. It's one of the things that we often advise on, is not just, do you have and are you investing in the right security controls, but are you thinking about the right outcomes that you want? One outcome that's increasingly important is having resilient outcomes. And that's actually really hard to do when you think about individual assets and individual security controls. There's a completely kind of shift in mindset when we're talking about resilience that kind of takes us from, and it's an important question, it's also a loaded question, are we secure as a business, which no CISO likes to be asked, but it's a difficult question.
There's a touchwood answer there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And it changes it to kind of what can we tolerate as a business? And to answer that question, you almost need the simplicity. And in my perspective, it's a simplicity of what are the services that we need to operate as a business. What services generate the cash flow, the revenue, what services enable us to meet our regulatory obligations, and all that kind of stuff. And you can often get that from looking at the value chain of an industry or an organization more specifically, to really understand actually what's important at a service level for an organization. When I say service, I mean it's your collection of assets and how they come together to deliver a service. And when you start to talk about the risks attributed to those services, it's far easier for a board to really understand the plain English of kind of risk management, what decisions need to be made. I think there's definitely a question that we should constantly be challenging ourselves on is, do our boards and our top level leadership really understand the cyber risks we're facing? Are we really communicating them in the right way, in the right form? And does it align to how other parts of our organization are also communicating risk?
And that conversation seems to be a lot more prevalent at boardroom tables, these sort of days. And I guess the significance and the importance of a strong CISO has really shot to the fore over recent years. Do you still see that as being something which, do you see a sort of growing appetite for that on the agenda of board packs and board meetings and discussion at that level now?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly do. And there's kind of two sides to it. There's one around, how does kind of top level leadership kind of lean in to really try and understand cybersecurity risk for the business face, and then how does the chief security officer or whoever holds that accountability and responsibility lean in to really help to educate the board on risk and communicate in the best possible way? And that is an area where we continue to see massive discrepancy, partly down to just organizational maturity, but also just down to the individuals within the organization, right? I mean, as you say, security and CISOs have been propelled into a very, I guess, exposed role very, very quickly. This isn't a role that's kind of been nurtured and matured over the past 30, 40 years. Relatively speaking, it's still quite new, let alone the kind of the chief data officer, which obviously is a lot newer in organizations as well. But with that comes, I guess, opportunity to really, take a chance to really think of what would really work for an organization, because there isn't necessarily all of those models and frameworks out there that can be leveraged that naturally. But then the other is, the downside of that is, from a CISO's perspective, there isn't necessarily all those models and frameworks to lean on. So you've really got to think what works for our organization in terms of communicating risk. And again, what we're seeing is, what works well is not necessarily having some freestanding risks that kind of operate in silo, but really understanding what are the risks that an organization faces at a wider, more comprehensive level, and what are the cybersecurity considerations that should be baked into those risks. So we're seeing more and more organizations work towards operational resilience. Great. How is cybersecurity considered within operational resilience? That's really important. Where we see risk management around cyber not done so well is actually where you've just got some fairly amorphous risks that are kind of floating around, which are actually quite difficult to interpret, difficult to understand. Okay, what are the real world implications of this risk? How would it come to life? How would it manifest within our business specifically?
Absolutely.
And therefore, what do we need to focus on? And that is an area of, as I mentioned, discrepancy. Some organizations will say, where we continue to be red in this area. We've got 30 green risks that we don't need to worry about, and you kind of often come across as, a 30 green is just as bad as one red, and the whole measurement becomes very, very difficult. So if you kind of take that kind of resilience focus and you start to think about the services, actually what you tend to find as a consequence to that is you can build a better narrative around consequences to risk, and you can build better understanding as a result. And build a better understanding, then you drive better risk management performance. You drive better decisive action that takes into account not just cyber but other parts of the business. And that's kind of the thing that we would generally encourage, is take a wider, more integrated approach to risk management. That's increasingly important.
And if you look at that and you look at your clients, and I imagine there's various ends of the spectrum about why they're coming to you in the first place, and there'll be people there who are at the end of looking to improve, and there's people there who are looking to maintain great cyber practices and such like. If we look at everything we've been talking about there and look at the very best of the organizations who you're seeing and thriving in the area, about how they're managing their risks, and you've indicated that just now, tell us about some of the sort of core traits, the sort of core takeaways that you would be there to be able to tell people these are some of the things that you can really assimilate best practice on to thrive in your team and managing your cyber risk.
I think that's a really good question in terms of those kind of good traits that we like to see. It can vary from time to time, but if I were to think about the common core traits of a mature business around cyber risk management, there is a very strong focus on things like continuous improvement. There's a very strong focus on, do we really understand this risk? Do we need to dig in a bit more to understand it better? There's elements around, we need to spend more time and effort thinking about things that we don't know yet. So the known unknowns, trying to discover the unknown unknowns, having a focus on where are our blind spots as a business. We think we understand our risks, but actually let's do some modeling and let's understand where's the business going, and actually what does this mean in terms of our risk posture, our appetite, and where the blind spots could be and how that could affect our business. The organizations that aren't in that space are spending all of their time on just how to keep the lights on, and so they don't have those traits yet. Organizations that do have these types of traits, where they're thinking about continuous improvement, uncovering the blind spots, they're better able to then actually automate and bring and rationalize security capabilities, and actually then make sure that the team are less focused on the stuff that is repeatable and focusing more on the stuff that actually really needs their expertise. I think the other trait is almost being ruthless on where the common sources of vulnerability exist, making sure that that risk is properly mitigated. So specifically secure by design. Most organizations, all organizations, are going through significant change, and not just from a security perspective, from an organizational perspective. They're going through cost reduction, they're going through more agile ways of working, they're going through digital transformation of many guises. I don't mean like moving to Office 365, I mean real digital transformation of the organization, transforming and modernizing business processes. Organizations going through that kind of journey, which is most of them, there are a huge variety of vulnerabilities that can emerge. So organizations that do risk management well are really good at actually trying to automate and make really kind of good repeatable models around how you just embed security in that change in a repeatable way that isn't reliant upon individual security experts. And that's also a good shift towards agile ways of working and things like DevSecOps, which is absolutely a trend that we're also seeing as well in the market.
Yeah, I think that sort of mirrors into our job, the day job, which is looking at recruitment. And if we look at DevSecOps as a sort of increasingly common trait for people to be looking at hiring, it's absolutely testament to what you've just said there. And I think there's more and more conversation around that. And I'm fascinated. Look, I've been a big fan of Toyota for many years in their commitment to Kaizen and continuous improvement that comes through there. And I think my view of the cyber world is that sort of never standing still aspect is something there which is a feature of all the best the best businesses in the space. Those ones there who are looking at this and recognizing that there's constant evolution in and a changing threat in how security needs to operate. And if we look at that and look at your opinion on this, on how security functions are evolving and the underlying drivers for that sort of change, tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand your question. I think when we look at different industries, it is really important to think about what are the traits and characteristics of this particular industry that we should be considering in terms of how we apply to our kind of individual vocations and our capabilities and areas of responsibility. I think the examples you gave there around kind of manufacturing, transport, there's another one on kind of aerospace. There are lots of kind of cultural aspects which are really, really kind of baked into the fabric of the businesses that we can be looking at. So how do we take advantage of things like that within our organization? So, energy and safety is a good example, right? The energy industry understands safety, right? That's an absolute truth. How can you take the culture around safety and leverage that to improve cybersecurity? What kind of platforms can we identify and then leverage to improve the way in which we manage security within businesses? And actually, I think there's an interesting point around risk there, which is not just around, how do you identify and mitigate risk, but actually, how do you avoid it in the first place? And I think there's a common gap actually across, organizations that we work with and organizations more generally, where there's a very strong focus on mitigating risk, but not enough around avoiding it. I think that's a good question around, that I think business leaders and CISOs should be asking and challenge themselves on is, can we preempt enough and can we understand enough early on to be able to avoid in the first place? Because actually, I think the answer that people will arrive to is probably yes, and it will save a lot of time and effort. What it requires, though, is having the right processes and the right culture to be able to do this early enough before it becomes too late within a particular life cycle.
Yeah, I think that's there's one thing about reacting when you hit, but it's about how you can avoid those hits at the same sort of stage to sort of bring a boxing analogy into the equation here. So it's whether you're going to be Rocky and use your face as your defense, or duck and dive a little bit further to be able to avoid it. So if we look at that and talk about evolution and talk about the those themes around agility and the sort of elements of cost reduction and digital transformation that we're seeing as very on vogue at the moment. And it's on vogue because of what's happened over the course of the last year. If you're now to sort of break out your crystal ball and look a little bit further forward as to what's happening in the marketplace and what's due to happen over not only 2021 but 2022 as well, what are some of the core themes that you're going to be looking at, and where are some of the areas of real movement going to be in the space, do you think?
Yes, it's a good question, and I guess just to continue the analogy somewhat, there's definitely a trend around organizations moving more resilience-based kind of outcomes within their strategy and to become more resilient as organizations. So the ability to roll with the punches is becoming massive. It's kind of top of the security agenda in many cases. That doesn't mean that security and preventing issues and risks, different types of events, isn't as equally important. That also remains to be really critical. It's just two different outlooks that are of equal importance, but to have two kind of distinct implications attached to them. In terms of, I guess, the macro level kind of themes that we're seeing in the industry relating to both of those, I think I kind of touched on some of these earlier. We're seeing many organizations looking to become more agile. They're looking to, depending on the business, deploy products quicker, get a better competitive edge in the market that requires them to work in faster, more agile and nimble ways. That is driving a lot of, I guess, endeavors to become more agile as organizations, as a whole. There's significant implications there on the security functions within these businesses and how that they can, I guess, orientate and support that kind of change. So I guess the first is, for organizations going on that journey around agile, there is absolutely a theme around security functions completely, fundamentally changing the way that they're structured, changing their operating model, changing their strategy, so that they themselves can also become agile. A common pitfall we're seeing is organizations going on the agile journey, but the security functions still working in very centralized ways, fundamentally creating incompatibility between where the organization is going and what the security function is actually prioritizing. So there's absolutely one around moving to agile. Other implications there include things like, if you are going to be federated, then what does that mean in terms of how you improve your DevOps, your DevSecOps? How do you take a more of an inside-out view of your security, not an outside-in view, which are things like the perimeter network, the infrastructure and the systems, more around the applications and the services themselves. So that's one. The other is kind of intrinsically tied to this digital transformation. This has been a theme for many years now.
But it's accelerated incredibly over the last 12 months, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's accelerated massively. And actually, the definition for many organizations, or the interpretation of digital transformation for many organizations, has changed, right? So for many organizations, it's how do we become more agile in how we collaborate with one another? Our digital transformation journey kind of looks more like that. How do we move to Office 365, for example? How do we make sure that we're making better use of our kind of remote meetings, use of Teams, and all the rest of it that kind of enable us to collaborate better? Shifting more towards, we need to save money. We need, we're on a cost-saving endeavor as a business to try and survive. So therefore, actually, we need to modernize much more than how we collaborate. Modernize our business processes. We need to automate our business processes. We need to restructure so that we can do that as an organization. There are significant security implications involved with that the security function need to stay close to. So, if an organization is looking to digitize, what does that mean in terms of the use of third-party providers? What does that mean in terms of the use of application and code that requires a focus? All of these risks that will surface because of this change need to be properly understood, because that is what's going to shape the future maturity of security capability. Wherever there's highest, I guess, inherent risk is where the higher level of maturity needs to be. And I think organizations that probably need to understand how the business is changing in terms of these themes. Therefore, how does the security function, the capabilities within security need to change in line with that, so it doesn't come out of step. And yeah, the final one which I mentioned is cost saving itself, which absolutely is understandable. Again, it's been a priority for many organizations for years, but again, made far more significant now as an imperative to the business in the recent kind of 12 months. And so there are implications there around, how does security function help the organization to reduce costs? And there's a kind of an inward focus for the security function, but also an outward focus. How do we, as a security function, reduce the amount of time and effort it takes to identify and mitigate risk and vulnerabilities? Can that be accelerated and therefore reduce cost? How can we as a security function automate what we do? How do we, can we have a better sourcing model to reduce cost? Are we doing things within our security function that are highly repetitive, not very complex, and actually have a natural boundary around them? Can we outsource, and what's trying to make sure we keep the expertise in-house? And is that a way of reducing costs? So there's all these things that I think security functions should be keeping in mind.
Where does the cost efficiency come into play there? Is it headcount? Is it just general cost? Is it reducing the actual impact of a breach or an attack or what have you? Where are the sort of real, because you look at things and we all know that over the last few years there's been a real premium on cost reduction, and I think cost of sale in every industry has got higher, and margins are getting squeezed left, right, and particularly in financial services, there's margins being squeezed left, right, and centre. So cost reduction is naturally on everyone's agenda. Now that happens in multiple different ways, and I'm really interested to see, because you look at cyber in particular, you think, well, there's not too many areas that you can prune without, creating bigger problems elsewhere. It's the classic finger in the dam scenario, isn't it? Tell me a little bit about where cost reduction comes from in the cyber world.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I have to say it's not the best answer, I'm afraid. It's a bit on the fence, but it's across the board, right? I mean, there's kind of cost saving endeavors that organizations can go through in terms of the people they have. Do they have too many people? Are they focusing on the right things? Can we actually, given we have a better understanding of the critical business services we need to operate, so therefore we know what actually we can tolerate, and actually therefore we probably don't need as many people as we think we do, or we can outsource certain functions. So there's something around there. I tend to prefer thinking around, look, if security is a space where we can't afford to reduce headcount, and there are other implications around the reputation harm that can come from reducing a security function headcount and then having a data breach, it doesn't particularly look good. But then you can think about, how do we improve the efficacy of the team? How do we just make sure that we're getting absolutely the most value from the expertise that we have in-house? And that comes at, okay, what are the inefficient processes that we are operating? Where can we drive better performance? So there's that kind of aspect around people. The other is just around the capability itself. Many organizations are going through agendas like security, orchestration, automation, and response, which is brilliant for actually rationalizing security capabilities, automating them, and making them more valuable. In turn, that leads to less of a need for individuals to manually administer and manage some of these controls to an extent. And that is a source of cost reduction as well. And then the other is just around general sourcing. There are many organizations that are actually, I think if they were to challenge themselves and say, are we doing the right things in-house? Are there opportunities to outsource? I think there's definitely cost-saving opportunity around the activities within a business that are, as I mentioned, repetitive in nature, high volume in nature, but actually not complex and not super high risk on their own, that are good candidates for being either outsourced or through a hybrid. We are seeing a macro level theme around SOCs going from completely outsourced to more of a hybrid model. So for organizations who do this in-house at the moment, that's a significant driver of cost. There can be opportunity around how do we go for more of a hybrid model. I guess full disclosure, Baringa, we don't offer any managed services at all. It's strictly advisory. So when I say consider outsourcing, it's not because there's a product we want to sell or a service. It's just the general direction that organizations are going.
So on that advisory basis, and tying things up here, as I say, you've got a huge range of companies that you're able to help and advise on. If there are people out there at the moment who where this is ringing bells and chiming alarms, etc., within it, who are you able to help? Who should be reaching out to you, and who are the sort of key stakeholders who you work with and tend to face off to?
Yeah, great question. I mean, we as a business within Baringa, we try and establish kind of real, meaningful and long-lasting change, right? And so therefore we tend to focus less on resolving the individual issues that are likely to repeat themselves unless there's an underlying root cause that's being solved. And that's where we try and place ourselves, at the root cause of risk and vulnerability. So in reality, we tend to work with organizations that are going through significant change, and we tend to help them advise on their change programs, advise on their change agendas. We also work with business leadership and advise chief security officers on them and their roles as individuals through kind of coaching capacity, or just being there to provide subject matter expertise on their strategy, on their operating model, and actually how they improve their governance. So we have a bit of a combination between how we actually provide leading advisory services to senior individuals within the business, through to, we can support you in developing a secure architecture. So having the kind of subject matter expertise, the specialized BAs who can support business change, the architects and the individuals that understand the kind of vendor and technology landscape and how to best implement those. That's where we tend to support clients. And I would say actually is almost a finishing point, with many organizations going through change just across the board, there is I guess one maybe piece of advice I give just to kind of finish up on. We see a lot of security improvements and improvements to capability that are then kind of passed to the business to then consume. And what we generally find is the capabilities and change that deliver to the business are kind of there and functioning, but they're not tailored to the business. And what you tend to find is it's that kind of final 20% of change that gives 80% of the value. And so it's really important for organizations who are going through significant change, whether it's cybersecurity or not, to think about what is the final product and the outcome that we as a business are going to accept from our change business. And does it align with how we're working? Or do we need to spend 3 or 4 months side of desk just to tailor and fine tune? There's a real point there around just making sure that the final product around change and security improvement is really understood and agreed. Because you tend to find that actually you don't provide meaningful risk reduction by uplifting security capability. It's got to be configured in the right way for the risk vulnerabilities that I guess matter to the business.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating viewpoint on it, and you're exactly right. That there is a lot of our business is based around change and transformation, and I think that there are obviously big change programs that succeed, and there's ones that don't work quite as authoritatively as you potentially manage. And I think it's that sort of agenda setting and measurables, and the strong sort of project pathway that allows people to know really where they want to invest. So
and that's where we play. That's the kind of market where we find we add most value to organizations, helping them navigate that significant change.
Which is the important bits of the sort of reins and the sort of, we always talk about it here as the bowling alley, the sort of the shutters on the bowling alley that allows you not to go into the lanes and hit the pins of it to guide people down there. And I think that's there's been an inexorable rise of Baringa over recent years. And as I say, I've sort of tracked the business from when it was a few people above a shop in Esher High Street through to where it sits now as a genuine challenger to the big four. And I think it's because of that advice and that strength of team. And I know you've been talking about significant growth of your business area as well. So listen, I wish you the very, very best of luck. I hope that I think there's been massive value that's been added throughout all of this conversation. I know we're going to do various bits of more content in future weeks as well to bring that to the fore. But David, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for getting involved on the show. If anyone wants to reach out to you, what's the best way of them doing that?
The details on the website, baringa.com, or david.prince@baringa.com. I'm often around on Twitter and LinkedIn, so fairly easy to get hold of me and the wider team as well. So thank you for having me, Toby. It's been an absolute pleasure to share some of the thoughts and answer some of your questions. Likewise, great to have you on the show. Thank you all for listening and watching, and we'll see you soon on another episode of Fintech Focus TV. David, thank you very, very much. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. Cheers.